apart from being significantly endowed with all kinds of precious minerals, Africa still remains surrounded by the narrative of poverty. And one of the things that has been said to perpetuate this cycle of poverty is illicit financial flows. The name is Wenson Mavora, and welcome to the TPSP podcast. And of course, today I'm privileged to be able to host I Everlyn Muendo all the way from the Tax Justice Network Africa. And of course, she will be making us understand what illicit financial flows are, the impact they've had on the continent of Africa, especially when it comes to Africa's economic development. Evelyn, it's a great pleasure to have you. And I like the fact that you are coming all the way from Kenya. Others like to say the headquarters of East Africa. But I know some people don't like to hear that.
Yeah, please don't get me into trouble. But thank you for having me.
Okay, yeah. So it's great to have you in Zambia. I mean, it's been a while since I saw you. I think it must have been like, is it a year? Is it 2 years or so?
I have lost count. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously, before we get into our conversation on the People Space podcast, we have a tradition that we like. People, when they look at you, they know you to be this person that talks about tax issues, this hard English that your people like, you're talking about this technical stuff. Not that it's a bad thing, though. We like it. But we like people to get to know a little bit about you outside your work. So tell us a little bit about who I Everlyn Muendo is outside what you do.
You didn't prepare me for this question. This is probably the hardest question out of all the questions you're going to ask. So I am a Kenyan woman, Kenyan taxpayer, because that's now significant. I am a lawyer by profession, and I am just generally interested in economic justice. I feel that a lot of African nations did gain their political independence, but we've never really gotten our economic independence. So I think this is the new fight that we all have to get into. Yes, I know that was very serious, but delving straight into the topic. Yeah.
Okay. So apart from the tax work and everything that you do, with regards economic justice, and it's an interesting terminology, that has gained prominence, economic justice. But then we'll get into it a little bit later on in our conversation. What are some of your hobbies? I know I know I didn't prepare you for this, but hey, that's what we do at the People Space. When they see you out there, when somebody meets you out there, in case you're walking in the streets of Lusaka, when you're here for work, and in case you visit the Victoria Falls, people are like, okay.
Okay. So this shows how terrible my work-life balance is. But yes, I do have some hobbies when I am not working. I really like to check out the countries that I visit. So for instance, I know this is cliche for most Zambians, but I really enjoyed the Victoria Falls.
Okay.
I really, really did. I think you have the better view.
Thank you. You see why it's important that I had to ask you this question? So I hope all the Zimbabweans watching this, please get it from her. We have the better view. Continue, please.
You'll get me into trouble. But yeah, I think Zambia has a better view. I also really, really enjoy the food in most African countries that I visit. So I also make a point of checking out the restaurants. So yes, those are my hobbies. Yeah, let me keep it there.
Okay, interesting. Okay, let's now get into our conversation. Obviously, I know that you currently are working at TGNA, and one of the things that you do there, obviously, is the issue of policy advising. Just tell us a little bit about your work at the Tax Justice Network Africa.
Yes, so I work under a programmatic area that's called Tax and International Financial Architecture. But then the reality is it's actually focusing more on tax and international tax architecture. So essentially, we don't live in silos as countries. We live in a world that is extremely globalized than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. So we're part of the global economy. And so that affects us in various ways. And one of the ways is through taxation, because you have multinational enterprises that pretty much operate in your country and are essentially established in various countries. So how to tax them is not just up to your country. There's a lot of international cooperation that must be done between countries in order to tax them effectively and make sure they're paying their fair share of taxes in our countries, as African countries. Yeah.
When I hear the word fair share, I'm almost getting excited. But anyway, let's move step by step. So, obviously, the Tax Justice Network Africa, deals with a whole lot of countries. And one would want to know what some of the pressing tax issues, on the continent are. And basically, how are they being addressed?
There's several tax issues that are very, very important for the African continent. So first and foremost is tax and natural resource governance. We hold at least, and I'm approximating, at least 30% of the world's mineral reserves, but we've never been able to leverage on these minerals for our own development as effectively as we should. So making sure that we have good natural resource governance, and part of that is the fiscal management of those natural resources. So, for instance, we are exporting copper, but are the companies that are exporting copper paying their fair share of taxes in Zambia? I don't think so. It's a yes and no. It depends. But yes. And then we also look at the issue of tax and equity. Tax is a measure that can be used to redistribute wealth in countries. So our question when we go to specific African countries is the tax system fair? Who is bearing the tax burden? Is it the poor or is it the wealthy? And unfortunately, in most cases, it's the ordinary low-income households who bear the tax burden, because most of our governments rely on what we call regressive taxes in order to raise revenue. So that's a problem. The other thing that we look at is tax and investments. So a lot of our countries are positioning themselves to attract investment. We don't have the capital, so we are capital importers. Now, the problem with that is that we use tax as a way to attract investors by giving away tax incentives. So you may find that in comparison to a company, you are probably paying more taxes than that company in relation to your income, that is, in relation to your income. So that's also something that we're really looking into. And then finally, tax and women, because at least women make up half of the population. And unfortunately, tax is not gender neutral. And it affects us adversely when the government is also not able to raise adequate revenue for public services like health and like education, which affect women more adversely than they do the other gender.
There's a very hot debate in Zambia with regards the issue of waiving off certain taxes in order to attract investors. Maybe one would want to know, is there a study anywhere, say on the African continent, where we could learn from, which has been undertaken, which proves that indeed it is actually logical to be able to get rid of or maybe give these investors a waiver and allow them to come and invest? And those investments, do we benefit more actually?
That's a really good question. Yes, there has been. In fact, there was an IMF study that essentially showed that tax incentives are not a primary attraction for investors. I mean, you have copper. Copper doesn't exist in Kenya. So it's not like investors will leave Zambia and go to Kenya. And mineral resources are finite. So their major source of attraction is not the tax incentives. And in fact, a lot of studies have shown actually that there's no, what's it called? Like there's no causality, let me call it that, between tax incentives and foreign direct investment. Like there's been no evaluation, there's been no cost benefit analysis of these tax incentives to see whether they're actually attracting these benefits. On the other hand, though, there is quite a lot of data. Actually, UNECA conducted one in Zambia a couple of years back that showed that we're losing quite a bit of revenue because of giving away these tax incentives. So that's actually a problem. They're becoming a problem. They aren't harmless policy instruments. Yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned something very, very interesting earlier on. You talked about the majority of African governments practicing regressive taxation. Just expound a little bit more on that, and how can we change it? Can we change it?
Yes, we can. It's just the issue also is for tax administrations, they normally look at what is easy to administer, what is easy to collect.
That's what I was looking for.
Yes, because every year, and this is such an interesting thing that we all do, every year people sit down and come up with a big budget. And somehow the revenue authority has to collect enough revenue to finance that budget. And so you have a tax administration that is under high pressure. So they will look at not what is equitable, not what is fair, but what is easy to administer. And in a lot of cases, that's consumption taxes. That's things like VAT, value added tax, GST, goods and services taxes, and excise taxes. It's really easy to administer in comparison to, for instance, personal income taxes, because we have such a huge informal sector in a lot of our African countries, or corporate income taxes, because a lot of multinational enterprises have enough resources to engage in what we call tax avoidance. So it's harder to catch them, and we're just the smaller fish that ends up in the basket.
So do we lack the capacity to develop the technical ability to be able to say, catch these guys in their craft? One, and secondly, you mentioned the informal sector, and this has always been my conversation with the Zambia Revenue Authority. I always ask them, the larger part of the business environment in this country is informal. And we keep singing the same song year in, year out of coming up with means and ways of taxing the informal sector. And we're not seeing anything happening. So what's wrong with African countries? Are they failing to just invest and improve over time?
So I'm going to start with the issue of technical capacity. We do have technical capacity within the continent. You have organizations like the African Tax Administration Forum that really provides that demand-based, contextual capacity building for a lot of tax administrations across the African continent. It also does that peer-to-peer learning. So we have that. I think it's just distributing that capacity that's the problem. Now, on the issue of the informal sector, I think that the challenge is governments always begin with taxing the informal sector. This is not something, formalizing the informal sector should not be the concern of the tax administration alone. This should be a whole government approach. And it really needs to look at why does the informal sector shy away from formalizing. For the taxes that we pay, because they do pay to a certain extent, consumption taxes.
Yeah.
Are they getting value for their taxes? Are they getting good access to public services like health, like education, social protection, amongst others? Or something as simple as consistent access to energy. Is it reliable? So those are some of the questions. I think the other thing is also essentially using technology and digitizing in order to incentivize the informal sector to formalize and making it as smooth as possible. Like tax administration isn't just about collecting, I think it's also about how you treat your taxpayers.
Mm-hmm.
And in most tax administrations, they have a very nice relationship with, high taxpayers. You hear about large taxpayers' offices.
Mm-hmm.
But then for the rest of us down here, the experiences with tax administrations is normally very negative. Its enforcement is too rough. Enforcement is too, it's honestly just too tough. It's too rough. And so once you have a population that doesn't have trust in the government, essentially, once you don't have a proper social contract between the people and the government, then that's one of the factors that is also really going to disincentivize people from moving from the informal sector and into the formal sector. I think also, unfortunately, the kind of taxes that we've introduced with regard to taxing the informal economy, like presumptive taxes, I understand that they are normally really targeting turnover taxes. And so the problem with turnover, not turnover taxes, they are essentially based on the turnover. And the problem with that is even if you're making losses, you still have to pay. And so the challenge is, as much as they sometimes put a small rate, it's still very tasking for a lot of these businesses. So I think before anything, also particularly for the tax administration, we have to get data. We have to get data on the informal sector. We have to understand. Because I also think we don't just have, people who probably are selling vegetables and are making just enough to make ends meet. You probably have people who are making millions, but they just choose not to formalize. So I think we need that kind of data so that we can come up with really context specific and effective taxes other than just presumptive taxes and turnover taxes. Yeah, sorry, that was a lengthy answer, but this is a really important issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you are leading the African group of CSOs on the UN Tax Convention. What are some of the issues coming out from the African countries?
Wow. Yes. So that working group is essentially about bringing African civil society organizations together to push for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. So as I said, the problem and the challenge is we can't tax multinational enterprises effectively without cooperating with other countries. Now, the international tax system, when it was established, most African countries didn't have independence. We didn't have political independence. So when they were establishing these rules, we weren't there. So when they were dividing taxing rights among states, the system that they established is essentially adverse. It's not in our best interests as African countries, because essentially they're giving more taxing rights to the headquarters of where these countries are established. Like the countries where the headquarters are, that's where they're giving more taxing rights, and we don't get as much taxing rights. So what we're trying to do within that working group is push for a fair allocation of taxing rights amongst developed and developing states, because most headquarters are in developed states. They're not here. They're not in Africa. They're not in many developing states. We are also pushing for international tax proposals that are fair to us, where the distribution is fair, where they also acknowledge the value that is created in our African countries. Yeah.
I know that earlier on you spoke a little bit in your examples when you're talking about Zambia, but obviously having this conversation, it would be unfair if we don't look at Zambia. So what is your take on Zambia's current legal taxation framework? Do you think it adequately addresses the issue of inequality and wealth redistribution?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I don't want to get into trouble.
Don't worry, you're protected.
The next time I come, immigration won't let me through. So one of the things that was noted, I think, a couple of years back, is that Zambia wasn't doing enough to tax its extractive sector, essentially its minerals, its mining sector. And also Zambia wasn't doing enough to tax essentially its companies, because there was a bit of a worrying corporate tax gap. Corporate tax gap being the potential of what you're supposed to be able to raise in terms of revenue, and then what you're actually raising. Like there was a bit of a worrying difference there. And so I think for that reason, you'll find that the tax burden has been shifted and is essentially being carried by consumption taxes as well as personal income taxes. And so, of course, because Zambia is blessed by copper, you have mineral resources. That's also in terms of revenue, not exactly tax revenue, a source of revenue for the country. Like your mineral, the revenue that you raise from your minerals is also a source. But in terms of now the taxation system, there's that bit of the tax burden has been shifted a bit unfairly. Like there's more that could be done to make it fairer than what it is right now.
Hey, let's now obviously talk about something that, I mentioned in my opening remarks and something that you also alluded to in your statements. How do illicit financial flows affect African economies? Because, sometimes when we talk about this, coming from the media, sometimes you hear people talk about, IFFs and, it's just that, it's just people like Evelyn, speaking good English and technical stuff about IFFs and nobody cares. But how do illicit financial flows affect African economies and how can they be avoided?
So maybe I should start with the definition of illicit financial flows. You know how you talk about a topic so much that you sort of know what it means, but you can't explain it? That's the case I find myself in, but I'll try my best. So illicit financial flows, it's all in the name, by the way. It's essentially money that is transferring outside of the country or the continent. So there's that cross-border nature, and its origin or its use is illicit in nature. Now, they use the word illicit instead of illegal because you also have some financial flows that may not per se be illegal, but they're still not good, like they're illicit. So there are different types of illicit financial flows. There's the criminally related one, and this one is so obvious. You can think of money laundering and perhaps the origin, like the predicate. I'm so sorry for using technical terms.
You're a lawyer. I mean,
The
what should we
origin-
expect?
and the money has of course come from illegal ways of doing things. It can be drug trafficking, it can be other criminal activities that I won't mention. And then you also have what we call the commercially related illicit financial flows, which arise from commercial activities. Again, it's in the name. So it's things like tax evasion, which is illegal. Tax evasion is illegal. And then it's things like trade misinvoicing, which is such a big deal for countries that are blessed with the resources, like Zambia, where people are underreporting on how much copper they're actually exporting out of your country on stuff like that. And then you have the other one, which is tax avoidance, aggressive tax avoidance. That the tax planning that these multinational enterprises are doing is really, really eroding the revenue of our countries. And then finally, the good old corruption. Those are the ones. So I hope I've explained that. And how they affect us is there was a study that was done by UNECA with a couple of other organizations. And it showed that Africa is losing approximately 89 billion US dollars annually because of illicit financial flows. And that's very, very concerning because when you look at our debt burden, for instance, they're almost similar. They're almost similar. And this is sovereign debt, by the way, sovereign debt. And I know Zambia can relate, and so can Kenya, with regard to a debt burden. So it was actually observed that when you look at all the internal flows, when you look at foreign direct investment, when you look at ODA, which is official development assistance, and then you compare it with for instance, illicit financial flows, what is flowing out of the country is greater than what is flowing into the continent. Actually, not country, continent. What is flowing out of the continent is greater than what's flowing in. So essentially, that means that we're actually the net creditor of the world. That we're losing out more than what is coming into our countries. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yeah. So that means that we really, really need to address the issue of illicit financial flows, and that we can't have economic self-reliance as long as we let this issue persist. And this is the kind of work that essentially TGNA is trying to do. Yeah.
You are watching the People's Space podcast with me, Winston Mavoy, and my guest today is Everlyn Muendo from the Tax Justice Network Africa. And of course, we are discussing illicit financial flows and what impact they have on the African continent. And you can also have an opportunity to be part and parcel of this conversation by simply being more interactive on our social media platforms under the handle the Center for Trade Policy and Development on Facebook and YouTube, and also CTPD Zambia on TikTok and Twitter. And remember, a comment or submission on each of the episodes that we broadcast on these platforms gives you an opportunity to be able to win fantastic and amazing prizes ranging from mug cups, t-shirts, capes, and of course, something that we have been advocating and mentioning, an opportunity to be able to have a meeting with our guests. I know she comes from Kenya, but you never know. So please take advantage and be interactive. And if your comment garners more reactions or tractions, you do stand a chance to be the lucky winner of some of those amazing, amazing and fantastic prizes. We'll take a break. We'll be back shortly and continue with the conversation.
Hi everyone, my name is Jito Kayumba. I'm a special assistant to the President of the Republic of Zambia for finance and investment. And I'm so excited to be appearing on the People's Space, the CTPD podcast that is absolutely phenomenal. And you should certainly tune in. And I've got a surprise for you that not only should you join and watch the show, but when you do share, you're going to get not only many prizes, but one of the prizes is that you get to come and have an interaction with me in my office at State House so we can talk more about ways in which we can develop this country. Now, the basis of the podcast that I'll be appearing on is really about national development. What are we doing for you, for the benefit of the Zambian people, to create jobs, to create investment and a better life? So tune in and we look forward to interacting.
Welcome back to the People's Space. Today we are looking at illicit financial flows and the impacts they have on African economies. And my guest is Everlyn Muendo, all the way from Kenya, and she is currently working at the Tax Justice Network Africa. And of course, she's giving us some perspective on what is happening on the continent with regards combating illicit financial flows, what is being done from the policy side of things to be able to address this challenge that has significantly stagnated, if I'm allowed to use that word, African economies from breaking through. And of course, I had mentioned earlier on that you do stand a chance to win some amazing prizes. And I just wanted to remind you that all you simply have to do is comment on one of the episodes that we broadcast on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and of course, TikTok of the People's Space podcast. And if your comment garners more reactions or perhaps triggers conversation, positive conversation, by the way, is what we encourage, you do stand a chance to win yourself some amazing and fantastic prizes ranging from t-shirts, mug cups, and of course, amazing souvenirs, And when I talk about souvenirs, winter is upon us. You can even win yourself some, hoodies, some sweatshirts, and all kinds of amazing things. So please, let's get interactive on our platforms and let's discuss some important issues that are not only affecting Zambia, but the African continent at large. So Evelyn, we continue with our conversation. One of the things that obviously I would like us to start with is you did mention, in your submission before the break, you were highlighting the need to ensure that multinationals pay a fair share of taxation, as it should be, as obviously is done in other jurisdictions, hence the development gap that we see between the third world and, say, the developed countries. I would like to find out, how can multinational corporations be held accountable for the role? You're smiling. So, how can multinational corporations be held accountable for their role in the African tax injustice?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. A heavy one. I think, it's I mean, we've put the burden essentially on tax administrations to track the amount of revenue that multinational enterprises are actually generating within our economies, to track the profits and to tax it effectively. But like I said before, it's also a matter of international tax cooperation. And we can't tax our multinational enterprises that operate in our own countries effectively without that sort of international tax cooperation. And when I say that, for instance, I mean, if a multinational enterprise is under invoicing, for instance, the amount of copper that it's exporting from our countries, it's a good idea to get data from not only Zambia, but also from the other country where the destination of those exports is. So that requires that you have two tax administrations that have this line of communication so that multinational enterprises aren't able to get away with such activities. But that's like an extreme case of, actual tax evasion and trade misinvoicing, essentially. In other instances, it's really about just getting an idea of the volume of economic activity in the other countries in comparison to also what's happening in Zambia, because of what we call, and I'm sorry, it's getting technical, because of what we call transfer mispricing, or essentially abusive transfer pricing, where multinational enterprises, let me use the word play, with how they price transactions between subsidiaries. And the reason why they do that is essentially to either reduce the amount of profit in that country so that they don't have to pay the high taxes, or increase the amount of profit in that country so that they will pay taxes there, where they have like tax incentives which allow them to pay zero to little tax. So and this brings me to also the issue of where you have jurisdictions that set themselves up or design themselves to essentially be low tax jurisdictions or tax havens. So the problem is, investors, instead of coming straight to Zambia, for instance, and just investing in, let's say, I don't know, other than copper, like the telecommunications industry or something, they're going to set up a company in that low tax jurisdiction or that tax haven and route the investment there, or they will route their profits back there after the investment that they've done in Zambia, in order to reduce the amount of taxes that they have to pay in Zambia. So we need to both do the work as the Zambia Revenue Authority, for instance, and the National Treasury. There's a lot that they can do. They need to set up a transfer pricing unit. They need to set up, we can get into all of that. But also, you can't tax multinational enterprises effectively if you don't deal with those tax havens of the world who know very well what they're doing and who know that they are affecting the tax bases and the amount of revenue that is being collected in the rest of our countries. And that's why international tax cooperation is very important. I hope I have not lost the audience.
No, you
With
haven't.
talk of transfer pricing and all, it's very hard to explain these things, I realize. But yes, that's sort of how we can hold them accountable for what they're doing. Because if you really think about it, tax isn't just some accounting thing in the air. Tax is human rights. Because tax is essentially the government's ability to either carry out or implement free primary education or not. So someone out there in Zambia is going to suffer the consequences of a multinational enterprise not paying its fair share of taxes. Tax is the government being or not being able to set up a maternity health program. Tax is the government being or not being able to set up a social protection mechanism for the elderly of our society. So it isn't just some abstract accounting thing. And we need, even as citizens, to not only hold our governments accountable, but to also hold these corporates that in a lot of cases are generating even more revenue than a single African government. Like if you look at, for instance, Amazon or Meta, it generates more revenue than a single African country. So we also need to hold big corporates accountable by demanding that they pay their fair share of taxes, particularly those in the digital economy. But we can talk about that in another podcast session.
I totally agree with you because that's another hot issue there.
Yeah.
But talking about obviously, when we talk about multinational companies, obviously there are international organizations that are also making frantic efforts to be able to ensure that, tax cooperation is promoted to be able, and efforts, are supplemented to be able to address some of the issues that you've raised. So how is the UN and the OECD basically promoting, tax cooperation and helping to combat IFFs?
Wow. So both the OECD and the UN both have different ways of doing this. So I'm going to start with the OECD. So the OECD has this initiative which they call the Inclusive Framework on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. Another lengthy name, they call it BEPS in short. And essentially, that was an initiative that was meant to address tax-related IFFs. I'm going to use that wording, and particularly the aggressive tax avoidance that multinational enterprises are carrying out. So they made it was essentially supposed to be for G20 countries, which Zambia is not a part of, and many African countries are not a part of. It's only South Africa and I guess the AU that have membership. And so the challenge with what was developed under the inclusive framework is that it wasn't consistent with the realities and the priorities of a lot of African tax administrations. So while it had started out with the good intentions of addressing tax-related IFFs, I mean, if you aren't at the table when these proposals are being developed, then you don't exactly expect that your concerns will be adequately catered to. And so there's been a lot of criticism, including from TJNA, about some of the proposals that have been developed under the Inclusive Framework on Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, and how applicable and how well suited they are for the African context. On the other hand, you have the United Nations, and the United Nations particularly has what you call a UN Tax Committee. And it's essentially a group of experts who come together, both from developed and developing countries, who come together to develop international tax rules that are specifically supposed to be easy to implement for developing countries, including African countries. But then African countries started getting a little frustrated with the work that was being done by the OECD under the Inclusive Framework on BEPS. Because they participated. In fact, there were like 27 African countries that are members of the Inclusive Framework, including Zambia, I think. And what happened is that African countries were getting dissatisfied with the international tax proposals that were coming out of that. And in 2021, actually, and this had to do with the digital economy, you had Nigeria and Kenya reject the proposal that had been developed by the Inclusive Framework, particularly on what we call Pillar 1, but I won't get into that. And so that did something to developing countries because they felt like we are negotiating at a place where we don't have equal footing. We don't have equal footing in the inclusive framework. So they started demanding for a UN tax body. They started demanding for a UN-led process where it's one country, one vote, unlike the IMF, for instance, and where developing countries could negotiate on equal footing with developed countries. And so that led to a process to start an intergovernmental process, intergovernmental meaning all member states of the UN, to come together to develop a UN framework convention on international tax cooperation, or what we like to call the UN Tax Convention in short. So that process has been happening since 2024, and right now we're actually in the year when negotiations, more substantive negotiations, will actually happen. So that's the whole history, or not the whole, but just at least part of the history of the UN versus OECD and their role in international tax. Yeah.
So just to put some of the submissions into perspective, if you look at Zambia, I was checking something that PMRC did some years back, which was, I think, 2022. They did a paper which was indicating that 10% of our GDP is actually going because of transfer mispricing that you mentioned earlier on, particularly in the extractive sector.
Yes.
So that's how much, even as a country, now imagine that was 2022, and that's how much as a country we are losing when it comes to some of these illicit financial flows. You mentioned collaboration, which is very, very important to be able to address this. Is that happening? Because I know Africa has a reputation for when it comes to collaboration, we don't do very well.
Yeah.
We are very, very good at doing things, each for himself, each by themselves, and for themselves,
And good for us all.
and good for us all. As we believe.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the issue of collaboration that you mentioned earlier on, how are we doing as a continent? Is there progress?
Yes. I mean, I can say in the last decade, there's definitely been exponential progress as a region. I think in the past, tax administrations really used to work in silos. We didn't realize we're dealing with the same multinational enterprises and that we're dealing with the same challenges, and we should be talking to each other and learning from each other. But then in the past decade also, you've had the establishment of organizations such as the African Tax Administration Forum, which is essentially tax administrations coming together and talking to each other. You've also had Tax Justice Network Africa,
TGNA.
Yes, which has been pushing tax justice, especially with regard to holding multinational enterprises together. I mean, not together, accountable. And so what's happening is that you've started getting that sort of mobilization. So that was the first step, just mobilizing. The second step, of course, was coming up with essentially continental level strategies and instruments actually to address this common problem that we have. And so I think one of the most defining moments for the fight against illicit financial flows in Africa was the release of the high-level panel report on illicit financial flows in Africa. And that was in 2015. And this was a study that had been commissioned by the African Union, as well as the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa, UNECA. And so this gave us pretty much the blueprint of how to tackle the issue of IFFs in Africa. And then subsequently, you got, for instance, the AU Specialized Technical Committee setting up a subcommittee that will deal with tax and IFFs, coming up with a tax strategy for Africa and also a strategy for addressing illicit financial flows in Africa. So we've had that level of collaboration. The thing that we need to do right now is implementation of all these wonderful strategies and harmonizing sort of our approaches on some taxation issues and having that line of communication, exchange of information amongst ourselves, and essentially coming up with a common position and standing by that common position when we're also in international negotiations with the rest of the globe. But there has been that level of regional collaboration. It's 10 years young, 10 years. It's still a teenager. It hasn't matured yet, but it's definitely there. And when I look forward, I see only good things for the kind of regional collaboration and level of Pan-Africanism that I'm seeing from this space. I know you never thought tax administrations can be Pan-African, but here we are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned that TGNA obviously works hard to be able to hold multinationals accountable while promoting tax justice on the continent. What else is TGNA doing to be able to ensure that this noble cause, is achieved?
Oh, wow. We're doing so much. So some of the activities we do is, for instance, we work with parliamentarians because we realized one thing that was missing from the conversation when it came to tackling illicit financial flows is we weren't talking about political will. And let's be honest, to a certain extent, our political class is responsible for IFFs, particularly corruption, but also they're best placed to push for the kind of reforms that we need to deal with IFFs as lawmakers of our countries. So we set up an initiative called the African Parliamentary Network on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation, which has been going on for a while. And we've made progress in very interesting ways. So for instance, you have essentially MPs who are put in the position where they're supposed to review any mining contracts that the National Treasury or the Minister of Mines gets into. And so a lot of times, these contracts were not there for public consumption. Like they were opaque. You couldn't get access to them. But in a lot of countries, through the parliament having to review them, the public was also able to access them. And by parliamentarians exercising their oversight role, they've been able to say no to certain contracts that were either giving way too many concessions or excessive tax incentives, and said no, that we need to renegotiate this. So no. And other agreements, not just mining contracts, like double taxation agreements, which are essentially tax agreements, investment contracts, amongst others. So there's been that kind of progress. And then the most heartening thing is when you see parliamentarians not just work from within their country, but work between countries. Because like I said, these are the same multinational enterprises. These are the same people. And they're like, they told us this in our contract, but they told us that in our contract. But we should both say no, Like that collective bargaining is really, really important and impressive. And I wish we could scale it up. The other thing that we do is we bring together the policymakers as well as the civil society organizations through what we call the Pan-African Conference on Illicit Financial Flows and Taxation to essentially set the agendas on some of this issue and discuss it collectively, like a multi-stakeholder forum. And I know you've been to one of what we call the PACs. And I think, for instance, we talked about taxation of the digital economy back in 2019, before there had been any sort of measures within the continent to start thinking about taxing the digital economy and approaching it as a continent. So that's one of the ways that we also sort of set the agenda on what are the most prevalent issues of tax in the continent.
As we get to wrap up our conversation before my director kills me, briefly, what is your final word to policymakers, business leaders, and civil society organizations that are all exerting noble efforts to be able to ensure that tax justice in Africa becomes a reality?
I mean, for me, my final word really is, we're not saying we don't want to pay tax. We want to pay taxes. If taxes means free maternal health care, I will pay even more than what I'm currently paying. If it means free primary education, and I am actually a beneficiary of that, because in Kenya, they started it in the year I was starting primary school. Don't estimate my age. But yes, if that's what taxes means, we're very happy to pay taxes. So we're all on the same side, ironically, with tax administrations. We're not saying no to paying taxes. We just want to pay our fair share of taxes as citizens. And we also want to see value for our taxes. Let it mean something for us, and most importantly, for our kids and our kids' kids and the kids of our kids, for future generations, essentially. Because paying taxes means becoming self-reliant. It means we don't have to rely on official development assistance, aid, which is declining because of the current geopolitics. We don't have to rely on remittances where our people go abroad and they have to send money back and they're working under such terrible conditions. So it really means dignity and human rights. Let me put on my lawyer cap for a second. So yes, we're happy to pay, and we need to do whatever we can to collaborate as CSOs, as policymakers, to really make this work for the continent.
Interesting. So obviously, implementation and harmonization for me are the key words that Evelyn mentioned in her submission that I feel are quite significant when it comes to ensuring that all the efforts that are being exerted by different stakeholders to ensure tax justice is achieved in Africa. So all the countries, it's not just a matter of talking. It's not just a matter of each doing what they feel they should be doing, but it's a matter of consolidating the efforts and actually putting word to action. And only then are we going to be able to see that indeed tax justice can become a reality in Africa. In Africa. And most importantly, another thing that Evelyn mentioned that is very, very important when it comes to promoting the issue of, compliance is the treatment of taxpayers. I think that is something that is very, very important that revenue administrations across the continent can be able to learn from. I know compliance remains a challenge, but of course, it's a conversation for another day. But how the taxpayers are treated also has a bearing on compliance in general terms. You've been watching The People's Space with me, Winston Mavoy, and of course my guest has been Everlyn Muendo, all the way from the Tax Justice Network Africa, TJNA. And of course we were discussing the illicit financial flows, their impact on the African economy, and what can be done to be able to curb this challenge. But not only that, what is being done? What are some of the progresses that have been made? Where are we? And going forward, what can we do to build on the efforts that are currently being done by different stakeholders? And of course, we've been enlightened on that front, and now we know what it means. And remember, one of the things that, again, I'll refer to is that the willingness to pay taxes is there. And this is not a fight against any multinational or anybody, but it is simply a call for tax justice, for equitable distribution of wealth through fair taxation. The name is Winston Mavoro. Thank you for watching. And remember, you can win those amazing prizes that I mentioned earlier on by simply being interactive on the platforms where we broadcast the People's Space podcast. That is on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and of course, LinkedIn, where some of the snippets are shared. All you need to do is simply drop a comment. And if your comment or interaction garners more reactions, you do stand a chance to be that lucky winner of these fantastic and amazing prizes. And like I said, it's getting cold out there. So there are free hoodies, nice puffer jackets, and all kinds of amazing prizes. In fact, even mugs, you can be drinking some tea in one of these amazing, beautiful cups. All you simply have to do is be interactive. Hey, see you next time before I get fired.